Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Gregory Brew, senior analyst with Eurasia Group. Gregory, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks a lot, Brittany.
I want to talk about some breaking news surrounding the ceasefire and hostage release agreement between Israel and Hamas. The Israeli Security Cabinet voted to approve the ceasefire and hostage release deal with Hamas on Friday, and this comes 2 days after the news of the deal being reached broke, and 1 day after it looked like it hung in the balance, and Netanyahu's office accused Hamas of, quote, reneging on the understanding and creating a last-minute crisis that is preventing an agreement. So can you please, to start off the conversation, talk about what has happened and transpired over the past 48 hours as it relates to this agreement?
Well, it's been very interesting, Brittany. What we've seen is kind of a dance, primarily from the Israelis and primarily led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, to balance the requirements of the deal with the requirements of Israel's domestic political scene. And let me break that down. So Netanyahu faces a significant challenge. On the one hand, there's a lot of public pressure to reach a deal with Hamas that releases the hostages. There's also pressure from the U.S., coming both from the outgoing Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration, to reach this deal. And by all accounts, by all appearances, Netanyahu has buckled to that pressure and has made a number of significant concessions. So a deal has come together, a deal has been signed, and the hostages are going to be released starting on Sunday. That's how it all looks right now. At the same time, Netanyahu is under pressure from elements of his own government, the far-right elements of his government and those within Israel's political scene who view this deal as essentially a stab in the back. They refuse to support it. They see it as a surrender. Netanyahu is agreeing to this deal while also promising on the side that it won't lead to a permanent end of the war, that the war will continue at some point, potentially after the first phase of the deal. So that's sort of what's been happening over the last 48 hours. A deal has been coming together while at the same time, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been working to keep his coalition in place.
And wouldn't the hostages being released politically, does that benefit Netanyahu? I mean, where is he right now in the political landscape in Israel?
So Netanyahu is probably in a fairly strong position right now. He's managed to weather the storm that has faced him since the October 7th attack of 2023. He isn't facing the imminent collapse of his coalition. He's obviously, as I mentioned, getting a lot of pushback from far-right elements. Two ministers, Minister Ben-Gvir and Minister Smotrich, sort of represent the far-right. Ben-Gvir has threatened to leave the government. Smotrich has made similar threats, but appears to be staying put. If Netanyahu loses the support of these two ministers, his government may very well fall apart. There would have to be new elections. The thing is, though, is that Netanyahu is polling fairly well. If there were elections inside Israel, there's a decent chance that he would emerge victorious. That's giving his position a bit of extra weight. At the same time, as I mentioned, he's making these promises behind the scenes, saying that this won't be a permanent ceasefire, that Hamas will be destroyed at some point. And he's making that promise also with the implicit idea that Trump will support a return to hostilities whenever Trump becomes president. So I think it's likely that he'll keep his government in place. At the same time, he'll be able to deliver a win through a hostage deal. As I mentioned, there's a lot of public pressure. The Israeli public wants a deal to get the hostages out. The polls overwhelmingly support that. So Netanyahu is, I think, trying to have it both ways. He's trying to keep his government together while also delivering a deal. And it looks like he is going to be able to do that.
And all indications look like the deal will go through. You said first hostages released on Sunday in phase 1, but can you break down the 3 phases for us and what's exactly in each?
Sure thing. So phase 1 is 42 days long, and it has a couple of different components. On the one hand, Hamas will release 33 hostages. They won't release them all at once. They'll start the process on Sunday and then continue it throughout the 42-day period. At the same time, Israel has promised to withdraw its forces from several key positions inside Gaza, the Netzarim corridor that cuts through the middle of Gaza, other parts of the territory, and will withdraw its military to parts of a so-called buffer zone around the exterior of the Gaza territory. At the same time, Israel will release a number of Palestinian prisoners, many of whom will be allowed to return to Gaza. And of course, there will be a cessation of hostilities. Israeli bombing inside Gaza will cease. After 16 days in phase one, negotiations and discussions will begin for the implementation of phase two. Phase two will see the release of additional hostages. Hamas will have about 60 additional hostages to release. Some of them are alive, some of them are dead. It's not clear how many. Israel will release additional Palestinian prisoners, withdraw from the territory. If those negotiations are successful, there will also be a phase three, which in theory will produce a permanent ceasefire. Now, as I mentioned, Netanyahu is saying something very different behind the scenes. He's telling his supporters and those within his government that there won't be a permanent ceasefire, that the war will continue. And I think the key to that will be Trump. If President Trump, if his administration supports Netanyahu, gives him the green light to continue the war, possibly after the first phase, I think it's very likely that the ceasefire will fall apart.
And if all of the hostages are released, would Netanyahu and Israel continue this war to completely get rid of Hamas then?
Yes. So the key there is, will there be hostages left in the territory? Hamas really only has one source of leverage, and that is the hostages. And the Hamas negotiating position has been to retain hostages, to keep them inside Gaza until there is a permanent ceasefire, until there are guarantees in place from the U.S., from Arab nations such as Qatar and Egypt, that will prevent the fighting to continue. Only then will Hamas agree to release all of the hostages. So it is a question, will Israel return to war even if there remain hostages inside the territory? As I mentioned, Netanyahu is saying that it will. While he's promising to release the hostages, at the same time, the way these deals are phased out, if the war does continue, there likely will be hostages remaining inside Gaza.
You and I have been talking about hostage release and ceasefire negotiations now for at least a year. And can you talk to us specifically about how these phases look compared to the May 2024 deal, and why, if it looks so familiar and so similar, why now? What has changed to agree to it now?
Well, you're absolutely right. The deal in its structure, the deal in its framework, in its phasing, looks very similar to a deal that the Biden administration put together in May of last year that Hamas reportedly agreed to. Now, we should note that Hamas's position has changed. At various points between now and May, they have moved their position on which prisoners they want released, which parts of Gaza they want the IDF, the Israeli military, to withdraw from. But Hamas is more or less stuck by the May 2024 position. The key change has been in Netanyahu's position. Netanyahu put up a pretty strong front last year. He pushed back against U.S. pressure to make concessions on withdrawing Israeli forces from Gaza. He insisted on a mechanism that would sort of manage the flow of people inside Gaza into North Gaza. And then he dug in his heels and he didn't retreat from that position. Now, there are questions as to why he did that. It's entirely possible that he did so because he was calculating that he could get a better deal under Trump if Trump won the election. And that is what happened. Trump won the election, and as soon as Trump became involved in the negotiations through his envoy, Steve Witkoff, we saw a change in Netanyahu's position. Did he yield to pressure from Trump, or did he simply change his position, confident of the fact that he would get support from Trump later on? I should note that, for Netanyahu, Gaza is just one of many issues that he is looking to the U.S. to provide support for. There are plans to expand Israeli settlements in the West Bank. There are plans to, further weaken Hezbollah in Lebanon, potentially enforce an Israeli position in Syria. Israel obviously has great concerns about Iran's nuclear program, and Netanyahu is looking for support from the U.S. there. So it's possible that Netanyahu did this as an olive branch to Trump to ensure greater U.S. support moving into the future. Those are the reasons that I would point to as to why there was a change now rather than 6 months ago.
I want to talk a little more about the Trump element. We are just days away from Donald Trump being sworn in to serve his second term. As you know, as we all know, this deal comes at the very end of Biden's presidency, and both presidents have been taking credit for the deal. President-elect Donald Trump said that this epic ceasefire agreement could have only happened as a result of our historic victory in November. And then a reporter asked President Biden during a press conference who gets credit for getting the deal done, him or Biden, or him or Trump rather, and Biden turns around and goes, "Is that a joke?" So how critical do you think President-elect Donald Trump and his Middle East envoy were in getting this deal across the line?
Well, it may end up being a subject of some debate until we know more about what actually happened in those meetings between Trump's envoy Witkoff and Prime Minister Netanyahu. We may not know precisely why Netanyahu changed his position. As I mentioned, he has reasons for wanting Trump to be happy on Inauguration Day moving forward. He maybe had fewer reasons to satisfy Joe Biden, particularly as it was looking possible that Biden would either lose the 2024 election or not be the candidate at all. I do think Trump is a crucial factor here. As I mentioned, it changes Netanyahu's political calculus and probably gave him reason to make certain concessions that made a deal possible. On the question of credit, I think there is a distinction to be made between who deserves credit and who will be rewarded credit. I think, generally speaking, the perception is that this is a win for Trump. Nobody's really giving this as a win for Biden. And that's a reflection of Biden's position. He's an outgoing president. He did not stand for re-election in 2024. He had to step aside in favor of Harris, who then lost to Trump in fairly decisive fashion. So, it's unfortunate that Biden's team has put in so much work, so much effort over months, only to see the credit go to Trump. But that's politics for you.
As you've said, the deal is pretty much all but done. Phase 1 could begin as early as Sunday with the release of some hostages. What specifically are you looking for next in the next 40 or so days in Phase 1 to ensure that Phase 2 and then eventually Phase 3 happen?
Well, as I mentioned, the negotiations for Phase 2 are supposed to start after about 16 days. So those negotiations, if they commence and if they are successful, would allow for the continuation of Phase 2. I do expect there to be almost immediate pressure from Israel, from Netanyahu's cabinet and his government to re-engage the fighting. And that pressure is going to be primarily directed at Trump and at the U.S. There have already been statements from Trump officials, such as incoming National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, to the effect that if Israel chooses to re-engage Hamas, it will receive U.S. support. So there's going to be focus on Hamas, whether Hamas abides by or appears to abide by the terms of the deal, whether Israel fully withdraws from parts of Gaza or whether it changes its deployment and remains inside the territory. That would undermine negotiations for Phase 2. On the flip side, if Trump focuses on maintaining the peace, on maintaining the deal, on getting more of the hostages out, that will put a lot of pressure on Netanyahu. That could potentially lead to successful negotiations and the movement of the deal into Phase 2. Again, I think Trump is the key here. If Trump supports Israel and supports Netanyahu, that could very well lead to the deal breaking down, particularly if Hamas chooses to not fully abide by the terms of the deal. On the other hand, if Trump pushes Netanyahu to keep the deal in place, then there's a decent chance that it will last a little longer than Phase 1.
Well, I have to thank you, per usual, for your insight, your expertise, for breaking this all down for us, especially because it has been moving part after part, especially over the last 48 hours. Gregory Brew, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Brittany. Always a pleasure.